Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 520. My guest today is Edith Forbes, a Norwich, Vermont novelist and a memoirist whose books have a knack for taking big, uncomfortable questions about morality, identity, aging, and how we treat one another, and setting them down in the middle of ordinary life where they can't be ignored. Her newest novel, The Lawnmower Lady, is released by Rootstock Publishing. It centers on Fay Kirkwood, a grumpy, sharp-tongued offshoot of an old New England family who chose a North Country farm life instead. Raising pigs and fixing lawnmowers, Fay dies at 78, then discovers she's still here, stuck watching the living deal with the consequences of a green burial wish she never meant anyone to take literally. What unfolds is funny, irreverent, and oddly tender, a small-town comedy with real bite, where death doesn't stop the gossip, the secrets on the moral mess, and because Edith has lived the Vermont version of the world farm life, town life, the whole close-knit ecosystem, she writes with a specificity that feels true. So if you ever wondered what it would be like to look back at your life with no ability to edit the outcomes, Edith Forbes has built a story that makes that question entertaining and unsettling in the best way. Edith, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Hi, well, thank you for having me here.
You're welcome. So for listeners meeting you the first time, what's the one-sentence pitch for The Lawnmower Lady?
It's a fun read and I hope makes you think. I don't know. um, yeah, it's about death, but it's not very solemn, I guess I would say. Because and maybe I'm old enough that I can kind of laugh about my own death. I don't know. Thinking of it that way. I mean, I don't laugh about when people I love die. That's different, but yeah.
So where did the first spark come from? Fay's voice, the premise, or a real Vermont moment?
Well, a couple of things. I've always, I mean, most of us wonder what happens after we die. I mean, you can have a belief system that is social, or you can have your individual one. But, it's hard not to wonder about it. So that was one of them. I just thought, well, what happens? I guess I'm a really curious person. So I thought part of me really wants to know, like, what happens in the world, after I'm not here. I kind of want to hear the end of the story. And so I thought, well, what if you actually got to, like, stick around and find out the end of the story, but without being able to have any effect on it whatsoever? So if you made mistakes or said something you wish you hadn't, you might be stuck there watching things you didn't plan happen. That was one. And the other little seed was one time somebody was talking about their little dog being out in the woods in a place where there were coyotes. And they said, well, you might want to keep that dog inside there'll be coyote lunch. And for some reason, that phrase coyote lunch just stuck in my mind, and it ends up being used in the book as well. When I was farming, if I had one of my young calves died at being born or something like that, I would take them out into the woods and just leave them there in the hope that the scavengers would eat them. And I thought, well, you could do that with a person too. Or so my main character made a joke, sort of would say, I wish I could be Coyote Lunch, basically. Or no, she didn't actually say that. Her niece used that phrase to describe what she said she wanted to have happen to her. But then the niece goes and does it after she dies. And of course, this is not actually what Fay wanted. I mean, you say this kind of thing, the way you say, I wish I could kill that person, and you don't actually mean it. But, it's a venting of an emotional state when she says it, but then,
Fay is a self-professed grouch.
Hmm.
What do you love about writing a character who's prickly on purpose?
Well, it's kind of my inner rat. I don't know if you know the Pearls Before Swine comic. It's wonderful. And I think most of us have a rat inside who's thinking these things that they usually have the wit not to say. And so, to some degree, I let her be, the voice of inner. I mean, she's actually not quite as prickly as she makes herself out to be. And one of the things, I don't think I thought about this, except it just kind of kept happening, is even though she's dead, she actually changes through the course of the book. I mean, at the beginning, she's just really mad about being stuck where she is, and, she's just kind of, so she's at her most prickly. And, and then she starts seeing the insides of other people's lives, and it does have an effect on her that she suddenly is seeing people from inside their heads, because that's where she goes, is she keeps being pulled, very unwillingly pulled from one person to another. But, it starts to change her in a funny way. Um,
Well, you mentioned funny, so it's like, so how did you make Fay the character funny and not just simply mean? And how did you kind of walk that line?
I'm not very analytic about how I create characters. She just kind of started talking. There is a lot of my voice in her, I think. I mean, friends who read it say, oh, yeah, I hear you talking a lot and some of that. So, um, because she was never malicious, I mean, and she has a lot of opinions about the world, and she's kind of sardonic. Her humor is sardonic, is how one other person was the word they used for her humor. But it's not exactly mean spirited, and she certainly isn't malicious. She's just kind of grumpy about all of the world, the world going ways she doesn't think are a good idea, or people being annoying, or whatever else. You know, um, I don't know where. I I do use humor. I don't know if it's a distancing thing or what. I mean, I just love, writers like Dickens and Jane Austen and people who, they were writing about periods of history that were much worse than what we're experiencing now. I mean, in terms of how people were living and the things they were suffering. And yet they were able to have a kind of ironic distance and humor. And I like that. So, that's what I did.
Well, what's amazing is that when you peel it back a bit, is that your main protagonist, the main narrator of this entire story, is powerless
Hmm.
through the entire book. So how did you write? Keep that. How did you write a character that is basically powerless through her own story?
Oh, well, that was what was interesting. I mean, yeah, I think partly, I've had people, I mean, someone who has young children said, that's a lot like being a parent where you're watching kids do something you wish they wouldn't do, but on some level, you can't stop them. Or, so it actually relates to the way a lot of us feel sometimes in real life. I mean, you watch what's going on in the world and you want to scream and you want to change it, but you sort of can't. So it to some degree it wasn't so far removed from what you actually experience in life, even when you're still here. And I mean, it was also just funny, because every once in a while, a tiny bit, she'll start yelling at someone, and it's like a tiny bit of what she is saying does seem to come through to them, and she doesn't really know, and she can't predict what will, and which she suddenly realizes this could be hazardous, if they hear the wrong part of what I said. Um, but I don't know. I've certainly had the experience of feeling like I have ideas come into my head that I have no idea from where. And, so then you think, well, what if there really is, you know, if there are dead people floating around, floating into my mind with opinions about what I'm doing? I don't know.
And also, too, a part of the book is there's also a level of small town dynamics involved in the
Hmm.
story.
Hmm.
How did you weave in the small town dynamics with this morality, spiritual, uh, death part of things?
Uh, well, she's watching what happens as a result, her death and the fact that her niece takes her out into the woods and leaves her under a tree for the coyotes to eat. It does cause a certain amount of reaction in the town. And so, initially that's primarily what she's watching is all the things that transpire immediately from her death and that. And then but then she starts finding out all sorts of things about people that she hadn't known, like the woman who's madly in love with her sweetheart, who's kept quiet for 30 years or whatever. Um, so I I don't know. These I just started. I don't. People started walking into the story. I can't. I'm not sure. I don't know how I can't really explain how that creative process works. I just found this whole community just started to feel really real to me, and the people I wanted, and I became very interested in their lives, and they're, kind of cheering them on in their outcome. I mean, in that regard, I'm like Faye, at the beginning, she's just grumpy about being there. And then she finds herself sort of like cheering for certain people and wanting to throttle other people. And I don't know.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. Did Faye kind of go off in a direction for you that you weren't expecting? How many parts of the story as you're writing it where you just kind of sat back and just said, "Let's see what's going to happen here"?
Yeah, I don't, I didn't have a super clear idea of exactly how the story was going to end when I started. I mean, I think I had a faintly some notion that I was never intending to write something that would be grim at the ending. I mean, I want, it was going to be, it's a comedy. It's not, it's not meant to leave you feeling, oh, the world is awful or, you know, um, yeah, it, and I think, I mean, the thing that happens to her is I think she starts developing, or maybe just being aware of more empathy than she realized she had, as she's sort of forced into seeing things from other people's perspective. Yeah, this person she initially is horrified about all of, towards the end of the book, she suddenly is like, but you're better than the alternative, as far as like someone who might end up with her sweetheart. It's like, I don't know. I,
So what was one scene you wrote that just made you laugh out loud while you were drafting it? Then
Well, I think the scene where where the person who's been longing for her sweetheart all these years comes back and says, I've got to end my marriage," you know. And then, of course, in the meantime, her husband has these other reasons for maybe wanting out of the marriage too. And so there's this very cross purposes conversation between them where, each of them is just completely not getting where the other one is. I don't know. I had a whole lot of fun with that scene. I hope the reader does. You never know if it correlates. Um, there are others.
right, because there's a level of humor and there's a level of really good character development here. Now, how did you decide where? All right, we're just going to let this scene ride because this is a really good emotional situation here. Or when did you decide, say, I got to put something funny in this because this is the perfect time to set it up. I could go either way. How did you kind of make those decisions on how you would do those with writing in those scenes?
I am not at all analytical when I write. On the first draft, I just let it come. Whatever wants to come out, I just let it come. And then later I'll go back and say, oh, this scene goes on way too long, or, whatever. I mean, go back and, but as far as like the original genesis of things, I don't know. That's when I wonder if there's just some dead person has been floating around up there who's like planting ideas in my mind. I don't know.
And now remind people is like, does this take place in a fictional town in Vermont, or is this an actual town in Vermont that you have this take place in?
There's no town of Gillum. I mean, there's no real town. I sort of was picturing, it's not even specifically necessarily Vermont or New Hampshire. It's one or the other. But, and I would say it's towards the northern tier of those states is kind of what I was picturing. But I didn't have a detailed single town in mind. I kind of took, it's a composite of different towns I know, elements of them. Yeah, you know.
Right. Now, was there then like a very specific northern New England detail in the book that you knew you had to include just because it has to give it that flavor?
Oh, interesting. I think the Faye's whole sensibility is a very New England sensibility. For one thing, I mean, so that's part of it. I don't, well, the weather is certainly, I mean, it comes into play at certain moments, like when her niece arrives at the farm and is standing there in the slush, and and you're, that that feels like, yeah, I, you know, certainly know that kind of weather. Um, Boy, well, I can't summon something to mind. I mean, I was thinking about the cold rocky hillside. I mean, when she describes how the transformation of the state as the interstates came in, and sort of real estate development happened, and you know the cold rocky hillsides became view potential, in realtors terms, that kind of thing. I don't know, those are floating around in the world around me.
So, how does this book compare to some of your previous books? Because you've written many books in the past too, and how does this one compare to some of your other pieces?
Well, it's completely different, and all of my books are completely different. I think it drove publishers crazy that they couldn't say, "Well, if you like the last one, you're going to like this one," because maybe or maybe not. I mean, the first one was, it was a coming out story, love story about a lesbian character in the West, Alma Rose, which is where I grew up. I mean, I grew up in Wyoming, so that was set not in a specific state. It was set just somewhere in that landscape in the West. So that was one story, was a love story about really somebody coming out of shyness as much as coming out as her gender identity or sexual orientation. And then the next one was set in Vermont, on a farm in Vermont, and it was about a sort of mysterious death on a farm. The father dies, and it's not clear whether it's murder or suicide, but a lot of family dynamics in that one. And then the third one was futuristic. I set it in, many hundreds of years in the future, when the world is really different. And the weird thing about that one is how much the world is starting to resemble what I wrote about as being fiction, because I wrote it back in the mid 1990s, and people say, "Oh, were you thinking of The Matrix when you wrote it?" And it's like, no, I wrote it before The Matrix came out. So maybe The Matrix was thinking about it, but I was not thinking about The Matrix. But it's a little bit in that genre, except unlike The Matrix, it's funny, and it's not, well, elements of it are funny, and it's much more lighthearted, and much less, well, I don't know. And there's no violence, except sort of psychological violence of the situation they're in. And then the last one, actually, the fourth book actually did follow a character from the first book, but it's really a coming of age story about a teenage boy,
Mm.
or teenage and then young adult boy. Oh, and well, the memoir was about, that's a medical memoir. I have a health condition that I mean, I have MS, and I wanted to sort of write about my experience with it. So, um, but it ended up actually being much more about my mother than about me. But
It seems as though, Edith, is that the the reoccurring theme for all your books seems to be stories about transition, like going from moving from one phase to another phase.
oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because certainly maybe Noel's passing a bit less than the others, but yeah, exit to reality. The people, I mean, they're like changing gender and various things happening. Um, and yeah, and certainly the person in the first one was, yeah, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Noel's passing was the least that way, but yeah, it it's true. People are evolving in a sort of essential way in the course of the stories. Um,
And what would you say then is that you learned as an author from your previous books that really helped you give voice and story to the Lawnmower Lady?
um, well, one thing I learned from one of my books was don't ever try to use a real person. I mean, someone you actually know as a character. Um, but not because it's hazardous or they'll be offended or something, but because you won't fully realize the character. You won't realize what you aren't because you know them. You won't realize what you're not conveying to the reader about the character. So, and also they might be a stereotype. I mean, I put in Alma Rose, I had a character very minor character, who was the small town doctor. And in the first draft of the story, before, when friends were reading it, and I'd made him Jewish because he was meant to be kind of not really fitting into the community a little bit, even though everybody admired him as the doctor. And one of my Jewish friends read that and said, "That is such a stereotype. You can't have the Jewish doctor." And it's like, I lived in a small town in Wyoming, and there was the doctor was Jewish, so I had based it on the actual Jewish doctor in our small town. But as soon as you made that real person into a character, then he was a stereotypical character. So I just changed him to be some other ethnicity that didn't fit in, you know, because the point was him not fitting in. Wasn't anything specific about him being Jewish. So yeah, that was a lesson. I mean, so two different reasons why you don't want to use a real person. Um,
Well,
yeah.
because all your books, as you say, are kind of different on their own, have you ever wanted to revisit one of those stories and kind of make a pseudo sequel to any of these?
Well, I did do the one that was Navigating the Darwin Straits was sort of a sequel in the sense that it followed the character who was a boy at the end of Alma Rose. He was like 12 or so, and it follows him into young adulthood. And so, some of the other characters in that book are also part of his story. But it wasn't a direct. It didn't exactly continue the story. It sort of took one character and where he followed what he did. No, I don't really. It's like people say, well, what else happens in this town, and it's like, I don't actually want to go there. I want to. If I, I wrote this book. It ends. It's. I don't. Yeah, I'm not a sequel writer. I guess I would say in general. I mean, the one
Right.
I did write was more because I just went off on a completely different tangent from it.
I mean,
Yeah.
you could always write about the coyotes in the area after this.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, this book has enough characters in it. It wouldn't be that hard to just say, oh, let's find out what happens to Jim, or let's find out what happens to,
Right.
but I kind of I don't know. Well, I'm not, none of them are sort of grabbing me and saying, I want my story told. Whereas Geordie kind of did. Geordie is the boy
Right.
in Elmer Rose. I found him talking. I mean, it's like I just heard his voice in my head. It's like, okay.
What made you decide to work with, say, Rootstock Publishing on this story?
Oh, well, this book was a really long time in the making, and a lot has changed in the world since the first draft. And I mean, my first four books were published in the old model of publishing. It was a small independent publisher, but it was in the conventional model where the publisher paid all the costs and did all the marketing, and you got a very small royalty. That was how publishing worked back then, but I didn't, you know. And most of those small independent presses from that era are dead. They've been killed off by the how easy it is to do self-publishing now, and they've been swallowed up by big publishers. So my first four books were published in the 90s, and or I guess the last one was 2001. And then I started working on this book back in 2002 or three, a long time ago. Um, and I finished a draft and I tried to, I had an agent at that point. I mean, I hadn't had an agent for the first three books, but eventually I did get one. And she tried to place it and couldn't place it. And I went back and worked on it some more. And, you know, and in the meantime, the whole publishing world has just completely transformed. I mean, it's like either huge or what are now known as hybrid publishers, which are sort of like the old small independent publishers, except that now the author basically pays most of the costs and does most of the marketing and gets a much larger share of the proceeds, if there are any.
Mm.
But there's something like 2 million books a year published now, which certainly wasn't the case in the 90s when when my first books came out. And most of them are in some fashion, either hybrid or self-published, and then a small percentage make it to the big New York publishers. And they get reviews and they do the marketing and so forth. But if you're at any level below that, so, I went through several rounds of either trying to find an agent or trying to get in with a conventional publisher and never had any luck. And finally, I thought, well, I want to go. And my memoir was published by the hybrid publisher in Seattle, who was connected to some of the people I had known back when I was working with the independent publisher I worked with was in Seattle, and so I knew some people from that. And they were fine, but this book is so regional that when I found out about Rootstock, I just thought, yeah, this is such a New England book.
Mm.
I really want it, and I read they just seemed like a good outfit, and they've been really a pleasure to work with. So, yeah, that's how. The thing about it taking all those years is that the book is much better now than it was. It's had many revisions, and it's way, way better than the first versions of it I set out. So, in a way, yes, it was a good thing that I didn't get it published too quickly.
Yeah.
And also the world has changed, this idea of a green burial, all of a sudden it's all the rage, whereas, it wasn't even on the radar in 2002 when I started writing this book. It wasn't something was even a term, never mind anybody actually thinking of doing it. So,
Well, I find it interesting. So, my brother's a funeral director,
oh,
and
wow.
so I find it. I'm really curious about why you picked the age 78 because 78 is young
Well,
nowadays. Yeah. So
it
I
seems
know it's like so
yeah,
when I was a kid, if you read the obituaries, if somebody died at like the age 75 up, they just said they had a but now it's like if you notice obituaries,
yeah,
anything under 85 years old, they die of something. And so
yeah.
now it seems like the new like old
Mhm,
age now is like 85 up. So
mhm.
I get why 78? She died at 78. What was that just
Well,
a random number or is that something that's significant to you?
no, that may be an artifact of when I was only in my 50s when I started writing the book. Now I'm in my early. I've just turned 71, so 78 seems much younger than it did 20 years ago. Um, but I didn't want her to be so old that it was sort of. She was pretty physically vigorous, and 80 is a real watershed. Even now, 80 is a really big watershed for people, for a lot of people psychologically. And somehow she needed to be a little bit short of that, but barely short of that. And also, it was also, I kept it set in 1999. I mean, that was the era I was visualizing, and it has to do with it's before there were smartphones, it was before there were social media, it was when you could have a flip phone, but the reception might be sketchy in Vermont. And there were a lot of, some things it's just the whole, everything about the book was from that era, and the whole time, just, I don't know, people weren't as angry then, for one thing. And And also the burial had to be something that would shock people, and now people wouldn't be so shocked. So, well, I think they would be shocked if you just dragged a body out in the woods, even now, I think. But, but yeah,
Like you said, like 78 feels that's young for an old person. Like that's like
yeah,
that. It's like you said,
yeah,
that's that cusp age. Yeah.
yeah. You can say she was a little bit robbed, but not horribly robbed. I mean, yeah, it. And she had a she dies very suddenly with, I mean, a stroke that just, um, so that can, yeah.
Now, so Edith, if people want to learn more about you and your work, where's the best place they could go to?
Well, I mean, I'm totally not on social media. That's another function of being old. It's like, I don't want to participate in something that seems like it's kind of destroying the world. So I'm not, so this is another thing that publishers aren't very happy about, that I don't have all sorts of platforms all over the internet, but I have my website. So if you want to read, that's pretty much it. I mean, there've been some articles. Listen to this podcast. That's the perfect way to learn.
There you
There you
go.
go. More people need
Yeah.
to listen to your podcast. I don't know. I'm doing readings here and there. When I have the opportunity, I'm happy to do them. But I'm not well known, so it's not like hordes of people come swarming in.
But so they can go to edithforbes.com though and see all of your
Yes.
other work.
Yeah. Yes. And there's a bunch of stuff there that never got published or produced or whatever. I've messed around with screenplays for a while, and I wrote a cookbook for my nephew, or it was aimed at my nieces and nephews originally, and it never got published either, but my family all use it.
Okay.
So yeah,
Yeah, and you got like a cookbook, you got some scripts. This is great, Edith.
yeah, but none of that stuff has ever gotten off the shelf, basically.
Right.
I'm not the kind of person who could market a screenplay. That's way more hustle than, and I don't know. I think it's hard enough trying to find a publisher for novels, but
Right.
I can imagine trying to get a movie produced.
This is great. So Edith, when your next book comes out, you're gonna have to come back on. This has been
Okay.
this has been
Okay.
so fun.
Well, it's just a gleam in my eye at this point. So yeah, but I would love to come back on if I end up writing another book.
When you end up writing another book. Yeah.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
All right. Thank you so much, Edith.
Well, thank you for having me.